It is 6:30 p.m. and I'd like to call this meeting of the Community Development Committee to order. While this meeting is being held in person, we are also offering the option for public to participate through Zoom if preferred. Instructions on how to attend virtually are included in the City Council calendar item listed on the front page of missionks.org. The public is also invited to participate in the meeting. If you are participating through Zoom, please either add your comment in the chat feature and it will be read out loud, or note that you would like to speak and we can call on you shortly to make your comment verbally. Please remember your comments or questions are visible to everyone in the meeting. If you are part of our in-person group tonight, please raise your hand but stay seated and we will call on you to go to the lectern to make your comment. When you make your comment, please state your name and city of residence for the record. Also be conscientious of others trying to speak and speak slowly and clearly. This meeting will be recorded and posted on the city's website at missionks.org. Please contact the administration office at 913-676-8350 with any questions or concern. Ms. Folks, could you please call the roll?
Boltinghouse.
Here.
Loudon.
Here.
Byard.
Here.
Inman.
Here.
Chociej.
Here.
Davis.
Here.
Our first item of business tonight is public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to comment now on an item not on our agenda tonight? Check the mic.
Thank you. Kim Donaway, Mission, Kansas resident. I have voiced concerns to Public Works and others about from the Summit condominiums project down there on Lamar. They are, it is their requirement for them to trim all them trees and bushes off. And if you ever go up and down there, you'll see children walking on the street. You will see the wheelchair people on the street on Lamar on that high traffic, because I have complained since last year for them to cut the trees and the shrubs away from the sidewalk. And it's pushed out so people are walking on the street. And so that's unacceptable any longer. And since I found out it's not city responsibility on that stretch, because it runs from Horton Street and Lamar, which is Summit condominiums, all the way down to Public Works, that needs to be cut back and cleaned up. Because if they can step 18 foot off onto my property illegally, you can make Summit properties, condominiums, clean off all that so people can walk on the sidewalk. I'd appreciate that. And all those people that are walking up, because I do have pictures of them. So I would stop and take pictures when I see them walking on the street because they can't walk on the sidewalk. The other is I just noticed the old building over here, thank you. And weeds are like up at here. And so that's been long overdue. I don't care on a business property if they've moved to a new property. Whoever owns that piece of dirt is still responsible for that area, and it's an eyesore because that affects our community development and how it looks and how it presents to the city. So thank you.
We'll now proceed with our regular agenda. We do not have any public presentations tonight, so we'll move on to our next item. We have two items coming forward from the Planning Commission's July 24th meeting. The first is for a preliminary development plan for residents on Rock Creek Phase 2. Mr. Scott, will you please share information about this item?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Residence on Rock Creek is a 168-unit multifamily apartment building that's currently under construction at 5399 Martway, which is the site of the former Mission bowling alley building. Developers of Residence on Rock Creek, the Sunflower Development Group, have expressed an interest in constructing a phase 2 of the development on the parcel of property immediately to the east, which is currently a parking lot that's associated with the former Mission Bank building across the street on the north side of Martway. Sunflower Development's been an application to the city for a preliminary development plan back in May. The PDP, the preliminary development plan, indicates an apartment building that would be 5 stories in height, 4 stories of construction on top of a 1-story podium parking structure with approximately 96 apartment units. Approximately 20% of the units would be 2-bedroom, with the remaining being a combination of 1-bedroom studio. The structure also has a 1,750 square foot retail space on the ground floor in the northwest corner of the building. The applicant envisions the space possibly being a coffee shop or a small cocktail bar. So the zoning is MS2, as is the current residence on Rock Creek. The maximum height for MS2 is 3 stories or 45 feet and 35 units per acre. The applicant is requesting a deviation from these 2 requirements with a building height that is 5 stories in height or 58 feet and 55 units per acre. This is consistent with the deviations that were provided for the phase 1 development and provides some continuity between the 2 buildings and that portion of Martway. The site will accommodate 98 parking spaces with 7 additional on-street parking spaces for the retail component. Parking requirements for the MS2 stipulates 1 parking space per bedroom, which equates to 112 parking spaces for the total residential component. So the applicant's proposing to enter into a cross parking access agreement with the owner of the former Mission Bank building on the north side of Martway that would allow for shared parking between the 2 properties. So the residents could park in the evening, kind of during the off hours of the office building, and then vice versa during the day. So the PDP was heard by the Planning Commission at their meeting on July 24th. There were no comments from the public at that time. Then after due consideration, the Planning Commission approved 7-0. So this item will be on your regular agenda for next Wednesday, which I believe is the 18th or 19th. I can't remember. 15th of August. Okay. 16th of August. So.
Has there been any discussion with the neighbors across the channel? Been any kind of meeting?
No, of course, we noticed it in the legal record and sent a notice to all the property owners with 200 feet, which crossed the channel. And we did receive 1 phone call from a resident of Rolling Court Townhomes. It was more just kind of an inquiry of what was happening, but nobody came to the public hearing that night. So.
Yeah, that was before my time on council when the initial development plan was put in place. How did the neighbors feel about it when the first phase 1 was discussed?
We had a neighborhood meeting at that time, and we followed it up with a public hearing before the Planning Commission. The neighborhood meeting, I think, it was during COVID, so it was all by Zoom. So I think it generated quite a bit of interest from the neighbors, but not nearly the amount of people that the neighborhood meeting showed up for the actual public hearing. There was a couple folks that were a little bit concerned about traffic on that street that kind of goes behind. We are going to do some traffic studies on that street, some traffic counts. But I wouldn't say it was a strong opposition to it. So Councilman Chociej could probably speak to that better than I, since he kind of lives in that neighborhood. So.
Yeah, I was present for both of those meetings on Zoom or whichever ones we held by Zoom. And I had spoken to a number of neighbors about the project before we really had those meetings. And, I think generally folks were curious and a little concerned what the impact on the neighborhood would be. But, once we kind of talked about it and showed them what the project looked like, it was pretty positive. We did have, I think maybe 2 or 3 households where they were worried about traffic, both foot traffic and car traffic. And that really, didn't lead to super strong opposition at the time.
Were there any concerns about the height of the buildings?
Not particularly, no. There's quite a bit of distance from the building itself to the residents to the south because the creek is kind of, so I think there might have been a little bit of concern about actually with the elevations, those properties on the south side of the creek are actually a little bit higher than the building itself. So it's kind of an equal. So somebody kind of looking out their back window, at least at certain points along that stretch, would actually be kind of looking at the rooftop of the building. There's always a little bit of concern about light and sound and things like that. The developers made a pretty conscious effort of downward lighting and trying to reduce the amount of lighting in the back and then providing some screening along the back of that existing development to kind of mitigate any lights from headlights, cars, anything like that. So.
Can you talk a little bit about the agreement for parking, surplus parking across the street? How long would that agreement be for? Because if that changes ownership or.
Well, the agreement would be in perpetuity and run with the land. So we're asking for an agreement, and the developers agreed to the agreement, to the concept of the agreement at least, that this is something to be entered into by the developer as well as the owner of that building across the street. And that agreement would be recorded at Johnson County with a recorder of deeds.
Okay.
And would run with the land. So it'd be applicable for any future owner of either building.
And the other question I had is, I know that with the current building, there was a lot of staging of material in that parking lot. Was there any discussion about the staging of material in that situation?
No, we haven't gotten that far. That'd really be more of a discussion with the general contractor once they're aboard. I think it's the intent of the developer to use the same general contractor that's on the property right now, building phase one, which is a little bit of why they're kind of submitting this at this time, is because as phase one is completed, they want to move that general contractor over to the next site and begin phase two, and just kind of continue on with that work in sort of continuous fashion. So, but when we kind of get down to the nuts and bolts, they're going to have to figure out where they're going to stage their trailer and their equipment and their materials. So.
Thank you.
And the developer does intend to come back with a request for incentives for phase two. They've indicated that they have not formally submitted anything. So there will be a whole nother round of discussions relative to the council's consideration of that. So as you know, there are two tracks that run with any project, the planning side and the incentive side.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may just make a couple of comments. The first thing I noticed is there is a requirement in the Planning Commission approval to look at the crosswalk situation. So I'm glad to see that. I hope we look pretty carefully at that, because with both of those units going up, I think we need to have dramatically better pedestrian facilities to cross Martway. So I hope, we're not looking at just one, crosswalk, but looking at that street in its entirety and ways we can improve that. I think that's going to be critical. The other thing that's right across the street, as was noted in the planning report, is the transit center. And so for that reason, I think, maybe it's not as critical that we have the, whatever it is, 1.2 units or one stall per bedroom for parking. So I'm not as, I don't think I'm as concerned about that, considering there's 98 spaces for 96 units. I feel like that's right across from the transit center, about what we'd want to see, considering the surroundings. And then the last comment I had on the height and the homes on my block here that would be on the south side of the development. We do benefit from having a change in elevation. The homes in my neighborhood sit a decent amount higher than the parcels on the north side of the creek. And also, fortunately for the residents closer to this phase two proposal, a lot more of the trees and vegetation was left undisturbed during the creek work down there. So they do have some increased screening compared to the houses around where I live. Thank you.
I have one more question. So were we aware that they had planned to do a phase two before? I mean, when phase one was presented?
When phase one was presented and approved, no, but they approached us shortly after the approval and we're kind of entertaining conversations with the owner of that parking lot about purchasing it and maybe doing something. Something wasn't really defined yet.
I think they
So-
spoke with several council members who were at their groundbreaking for phase one about at least the thought of potentially pursuing a phase two.
Yeah, that's correct.
Is there a recommendation?
I think this.
Yeah, this goes straight on the agenda, so,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay, any other questions about this? Okay. The second item coming from the Planning Commission is related to zoning code amendments regarding tobacco retailer buffer regulations, also from Brian Scott.
Okay, thank you. So the city of Mission has long been a leader in promoting community health. To this end, the city adopted an indoor smoking ordinance in 2008 prohibiting smoking in any enclosed structure except a private residence. For the past several months, the city council has been discussing the proliferation of electronic cigarette retailers and vape shops within cities around the metropolitan area, and what can be done to possibly mitigate the potential of the situation of Mission, in particular with a focus on preventing access for youth, those under 21, to tobacco and electronic cigarettes. In March of this year, the city council adopted an ordinance establishing a 150-day moratorium on the issuance of any business license to a new tobacco retailer for the purpose of allowing staff time to work with legal counsel to do further research and craft an ordinance that would stipulate the distance requirements between current tobacco retailers and future tobacco retailers, as well as parks, churches, and schools. This draft ordinance was presented to the Planning Commission on July 24th of the regular meeting, and a public hearing was held. Essentially, the ordinance, and you all are familiar with it, would provide a 1,000-foot buffer between existing tobacco retailers that already have a license in the city to sell tobacco products and any potential new tobacco retailer that may be coming into the city, as well as a 1,000-foot buffer from tobacco retailers, new tobacco retailers in churches, schools, and parks. The Planning Commission held a public hearing on this ordinance, had some discussion, and approved recommendation 7-0. And this will also be on your city council agenda on the 15th.
And I believe you had no public that
Correct.
spoke
Yeah,
either in
there's-
favor of or against.
yeah, there's no one present.
Are there any questions or comments from the committee? Go ahead.
Couple things. Number one, I just wanted to mention that there was a letter that was issued by the Tobacco Free Kansas Coalition that was added to the packet subsequent to the initial mailing in support of this zoning change. There was also discussion about the mixed use and whether or not the gateway is going to be included in this or not. Can you speak to that?
So I think the conversation that we had at the time was there are a number of uses that are included or excluded from the mixed use zoning classification that we wanted to revisit more comprehensively. And since there is no current development occurring at the Gateway site, we felt we had time to be able to do that rather than carve out a single exception at this time, but it is definitely on the radar.
Is the moratorium then going to be allowed to lapse as of August 21st?
Yes, you would have to take action to extend it or it will automatically lapse as of August 21st.
Thank you.
Our first action item this evening is the acceptance of the meeting minutes from Robin Folks.
Thank you. Draft minutes of the July 5th Community Development Committee meeting are included for review and acceptance in your packet tonight.
I recommend that we go ahead and put this on consent agenda. Just to mention that Robin has corrected the fact that Debbie Kring was absent due to her surgery. So both these committee minutes and the one for Finance and Administration have been modified to reflect that.
Okay. Next, we will consider an interlocal agreement for the 2022 Stormwater System Renewal Project. Mr. Morton is out of the office this week, so Ms. Smith, can you please share the information on this item?
Yes, and Mr. Wharton is on a well-deserved vacation this week. So happy to be here. I think you're all familiar. We've talked on several occasions about the transition or the introduction through the SMAC program to be able to take on maintenance projects. And although the planning horizon, we have to be thinking 18 to 24 months ahead. Our public works staff has done a great job of trying to align our street projects and standalone stormwater projects with this program. You may recall we approved a similar interlocal agreement last month for the inventory, the updated inventory with Trek to complete the crawler cameras through some of those sections of pipe. This is for the other 2022 project that we were approved for, and this is stormwater work that was done in connection with the 2022 street preservation program. And so this is simply the kind of the last formal step, which would allow us to apply for reimbursement of about $43,884 through the Johnson County Stormwater Management Program.
Okay, are there any questions or comments from the committee? Okay, is there a recommendation?
I recommend that we take this to council on consent.
Agree.
All right. Our final action item tonight will be for the consideration of parking lot repairs at the Powell Community Center and Mission Square from Penn Alimony.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So prior to my time, we entered into an agreement with Mission Square, sort of a partnership that we would include all of their parking lot upgrades and improvements along with ours. So that's why they're rolled into this action item. But in 2015 was the last time the Powell Community Center parking lot was seal coated. And 2019, Mission Square had significant improvements done to some depressions, a couple leaks, and then they also got seal coated in 2019. So those were the most recent, just completely 2 coats of essentially tar overlay to protect the entire asphalt surface. Since then, in 2021, we went through a mill and overlay on about 10 to 12 different areas and one pretty significant spot on the west side of the parking lot, and crack sealed. And that crack seal applied to both Mission Square and the community center. But since then, weather keeps taking a toll on the parking lot, drivers, you name it. We reached out to 5 different parking lot contractors to perform this work. 2 of them were responsive, and Prime Asphalt was the lowest, most responsive bid at $21,300. Initially, we had set aside $57,000 for this project to include both mill overlay as well as crack seal and then seal coating. And you can tell from that 21,000 and an additional 5,000 that internal staff would be doing for the paint striping, that puts us about $30,000 under budget, which is great this time of year. So staff is recommending approval for a contract with Prime Asphalt for crack seal, crack fill, seal coat, and mill and overlay for $21,300. This project is anticipated to occur late September, early October, and will be coordinated with Mission Square so that doesn't impact their patrons or the Powell Community Center patrons. I'm happy to take any questions.
I might just for clarification, because I know there were several who were not on the council when we entered into the agreement with Mission Square, but that was originally parking lot that was associated with the Powell Community Center. And that parcel was sold for that development. Mission Square is a not-for-profit entity. And so we did enter into a pilot or payment in lieu of taxes agreement with Mission Square at the time. And they have contributed, and they contribute in the neighborhood of between $45,000 and $50,000 a year. Part of which secures memberships for their residents at the community center. But there is also a portion of that fund that is available to help offset the maintenance responsibilities that we took on as a part of that.
Thank you for that clarification. All right. Any others? Okay, is there a recommendation?
Yeah, I recommend that we take this to council on consent.
All right. That concludes our action items. We have one discussion item this evening, a presentation of the Powell Community Center feasibility study and business plan from Penn Elmany. Waiting for this.
Okay. Okay. The time we've all been waiting for. This is taking a little bit longer than we anticipated. I know initially when we had set the action plan, we anticipated this project being done within 6 to 8 months. And it's extended about a year and a half now. So we're happy to be at this point where we can discuss with you some of the findings and answer any questions. But just in history, we're well aware the community center was an early adopter within the region, built in 1999, almost doubled in size in 2004. And as a result, we built it, they came, and we thrived for quite some time. Over the last 10 years, other cities have improved their programming. They've built facilities meeting their residents' needs. And so some of that has peeled away membership, peeled away some loyalty. Overland Park, Lenexa, and most recently Merriam. So like we mentioned here, they've got similar experiences, similar amenities, a little bit shinier and new. COVID definitely had some impacts associated with our membership and attendance. Some decisions we had made as a community hastened some of those evolving trends. And then what brought us to this point is obviously our care for the facility, our care for residents, and making sure that we can provide a wonderful amenity to residents and non-residents without sinking some of these other imperatives within our budget. So cost recovery pre-COVID was right around that 75 to 80%, and that was trending a little bit higher because of some of these facilities and neighboring pressures. So our members were decreasing. Some of that financial impact we saw pretty early on. I think what was interesting to me throughout this analysis was we jumped in with pros, and we had talked about a 3 to 5 year look back. And obviously at that point, 2.5 of those years were COVID related. And so it really didn't serve us very much benefit to say, oh, this pandemic really hurt your business model. So we really had to scale back that 5 years from pre-COVID. And that gave me an opportunity to catch up on some of those trends initially and notice that, our membership was declining 5 years prior to COVID. And COVID really just hastened that moment. So in 2020, we went pretty stark contrast from 75% ish the previous year down to 34% cost recovery. Pretty similar in 21. 22, we saw a healthy rebound. Some of that was due to a child care aware grant that we had applied for, which spanned both 22 and will impact some of our revenues for the positive this year. And then through the analysis, don't want to ruin the final, what do they call it? Punchline. Thank you. Don't want to ruin the punchline, but our goal is to reach 70%. I think council, at least from preliminary discussions, felt confident with that. And PROS feels that that's accomplishable given their business plan and recommendations within the next 2 to 3 years. So we're happy to see that and discuss some of those elements. We know that there's a ripple effect anytime you have a planned subsidy and that subsidy increases. Obviously, other facets of the budget can't get funded. So the goal is to have that plan in place and follow it and utilize some of the tools that PROS has armed us with. What's nice about them is through that year and a half, they didn't kind of hold any of these tools and models close to the vest. They actually worked with our team and gathered the data and then sat down with team members, specifically coordinators and some of our supervisors, and made sure they understood the data first and foremost, and then kind of modeled that data and said, this is what I mean when I talk about room capacity. And so we'll dig into that a little bit, but obviously we want to sustain and deliver quality programs and services, and then make sure that we're not unintentionally bleeding into that subsidy and budget allotment for other elements. Dang it. Here we go. Okay. So they provided a framework for us where we reviewed the programs, reviewed revenues, we set goals. We reviewed all the staffing levels, both our ideal as well as, the existing. We reviewed how and why we deliver the programs we do, and then listen to some of their feedback on life cycle analysis, when to introduce new programs versus when to discuss retiring kind of the programs once they hit that saturation stage, and how we manage and use the facility. Was they sat down with us, obviously being in the middle of COVID. We had moved all of our city meetings and operations over to the community center. And so at first blush, it looked like we were, housing all of these city meetings within the community center and just putting ourselves behind the 8 ball in terms of cost recovery. But we quickly, corrected that mindset and were able to say, no, this is short term. And obviously we've got other uses for these spaces. And then ultimately the cost analysis function, which really came down to, I think, a recreation program supervisor is well-versed in cost analysis. I'm well-versed in cost analysis. It ultimately came down to, are you setting enough time aside to do that consistently throughout each program, each season, and then including some of the, indirect costs that we weren't including initially, such as dividing out full-time wages between all events and programs, and just making sure that we're considering those types of costs. So through the key findings, this is one of the 13 pieces of a 130-page document that kind of gets to the heart of what the business plan is for us. There's ultimately a program shortage that generates enough revenue to offset some of those costs. So we provide significant number of programs, and due to attendance numbers being low or the time of day, it's not the right alignment. And so this business plan addresses that in hopes of correcting that so that we can either add more programs that have a wider appeal, or fine-tune the hours that those are offered. We've got a strong rental record right now. It's continuing to pick up to pre-COVID levels, which is wonderful. My takeaway from this is let's lean into that. And if that's how the region sees us, let's see that as a strength and kind of enforce that and, use opportunities to market the spaces that are designed for that. Unfortunately, some of our costs don't account for all of the costs associated with rentals, things like staff maintenance and pickup. And we had initially set aside costs, we put them in hour increments instead of the hour and a half now, because you got set up takedown time on both the back and front end. So those are now included in some of our models. Capacity use analysis, which was great for us. It was great for our team to look at and review. I think we're all familiar with the term fair use as a team. That was kind of the standard is, well, rentals get this amount, programs get this amount because it's fair. And I think this process has opened our eyes to deliver what the end user needs. And so we've taken this capacity use analysis, and that'll be a heavy part of all of our programming decisions. And I'll talk about prime time versus non-prime time in a little bit. Existing program portfolio needs strengthened. I kind of leaned into that on the first point. Individual and organization use fees need review with the intent to aid cost recovery elements. I don't think it's anyone's fault that when you have the discussion of being affordable to individuals, but when you have that discussion without other considerations and ways to offset affordability and using some of those models, you put yourself in a difficult situation. And so part of our task going forward is reviewing that analysis, seeing how we can meet cost recovery goals, consider people who can afford, and consider those who want to use the facility and be there for them. Pros gave us a significant number of key performance indicators. That was one of the most important things to me. I think I've heard it from many council members that this is important to them so monthly attendance was an important key performance indicator. How many members that we have from one month to next is a key performance indicator. However, they're only important if you can use them in driving decisions. And so their models allow us to take those KPIs and translate them into decisions that kind of help educate our next steps. So membership options, they had talked about initially us offering too many membership options. And I remember fondly Councilmember Boltinghouse reaching out to me initially and saying, I don't want to get lost in the weeds, make this simpler for me and my family, for all residents. And so we took that to heart and really whittled down our membership offerings so that they were simple to understand to anyone who just either opened that venture guide or looked online. So they didn't have to have a degree and figure out how much it costs per month per individual and those types of things. So I think we made strides in that area, but their point of emphasis was making sure that whatever membership offerings we have, that we don't give away the farm with that membership offering. And so that was an important takeaway from them. Making sure that we've got a marketing plan in place. Emily and I have discussed some of these elements, and we've got a contract renewal coming up where this is going to be at the forefront of that discussion and how we meet the needs of not only, rentals, parties, memberships. Those are a lot of different marketing pieces that we need to discuss. It's pretty apparent through all of the action items over the last 3 years that I've been here that we're catching up on a lot of deferred maintenance, and that takes time to gather bids, to follow up with contractors, to create narratives and just follow up and making sure they're getting done. So I'm excited. Can't tell you how excited we're getting to a reasonable level of maintenance and capital improvements. And I think we can focus more time on other areas as a result. Our reports need strengthen. While we were pulling data, it became pretty apparent that pros kept asking follow-up questions on these pieces of data. And so the data that we were able to supply to them pre-COVID was a different registration platform, different formatting. In the midst of COVID, obviously newer platform, different format. And so marrying the two was a difficult task. Getting them to be understandable was difficult. And so we had to clean up a lot of data, which translated to a longer timeline of delivery. But we're hopeful that we can create some custom reporting here in the short term to help us make that decision better. They were also quick to point out that our team's dedicated, which I thought was nice to hear, that it's not a matter of people not wanting to do a good job and really wanting to sink the ship. But it's people dedicated and focused on their needs. And now we've kind of taken that input and trying to have a holistic view of the entire community center and how we can operate that better. In-house marketing has improved throughout the course of their data analysis. So I appreciated that they noticed that, and it has impacted our membership, has picked up in the last year and a half. And that our frontline team has got high standards of customer service. I hope our residents and visitors feel that, because it's definitely a focus in all of our meetings. But those were some of their key findings. And so this business plan for us really helps, like I had mentioned, deliver some of the tools, some of the models, and the worksheets that are going to educate and move some of our decision-making, both in the short term as well as 24 and moving forward. So off to the left here is an example of prime versus non-prime. And so in terms of rental use, we had kept a calendar of use and just kind of kept track of it from previous year's use. And so we could quickly speak to, well, our numbers are trending down compared to this year or compared to this time last year, but we couldn't speak to hourly versus and prime versus non-prime. And so pros shared with us that prime is really 4 hours of a work day week or a work day. And that's typically 5:30 to 9:30. And that's when the most users want to utilize your facility. And so for us, that's 5:30 to 9:30 each weeknight. And on weekends, that's typically 12 or 1 to like 6 p.m. because before that, obviously the running errands, after that, other plans. So in terms of prime and non-prime, it's important for us to compartmentalize any programming and offering in a prime category as competing against a potential rental or a potential partnership. And then non-prime is when we really need to bolster and kind of invite and usher in as many people as possible because they've got competing interests. They've got work, school, they're running errands, doing all of these things from 5:30 in the morning until 5:30 in the evening. And so that's really incumbent on us to market to the nth degree and find opportunities to raise that. And so what this translates to is essentially an available number of hours each day. And then that continues for each month and each year. And then however many hours that you've booked versus compared to the number of hours that were available, which gives you that total percentage. And so that percentage on the right, you can see for December, which is kind of a heavy use month. It's total non-prime hours was, what's that, 17.5%. Total prime hour use was 0.5%. And so that number there really needs to be right around 0.6 in their world to be meeting our goals of cost recovery. And so if we can see that, almost 18% use go up, even double, then we're going to start seeing some of those cost recovery type deliverables, which is wonderful. But then that takes you to the end percentage there, which is about 30% total usage. So we can see that we've got a fair amount of work to go to get to our capacity use. But that's part of what we're taking. We take this information, create a plan, adopt that plan, train our team, and make sure that we're well versed in these elements so that we can apply them moving forward. So in terms of implementation, we've got kind of a short and middle term implementation. Number one goal that staff felt was just absolutely imperative was creating a revenue policy. So some of our neighboring communities and facilities have examples of that. We've reached out to them and gathered it. So that'll be a short-term deliverable that we'll kind of put our own flavor and standards to and bring forward to you so that you can have an opportunity to weigh in and make sure that that fulfills mission's goals. And part of the revenue policy, just for clarity, it balances out essential programs versus important versus value added. And what's that threshold for mission? Do we want to 100% support all essential programming? So something like CPR or swim lessons, we put a range in there that says we're okay subsidizing, 20% or 40% of these, and the rest is on the end user to pay for. And so those will be some of the inclusions in a revenue policy. Some fees, charges, refund policies, the balance of residency discounts versus non-residency pricing levels, those will all be included so that we have an opportunity to just be completely transparent as a council and making sure that we're on the same page moving forward. This next one is near and dear to my heart because we've absorbed a lot of the workload from our previous administrative supervisor since her retirement in January of 22. We've kind of divided out relatively equally among our vision team. And obviously that's got impacts. So pros recommended that we alter the title a little bit to show that it's more of an analysis position. It's got some financial elements that need to be a part of it and has got to be a strength. And I love that when Laura and I were discussing this, she had mentioned there's a unicorn in the Parks and Recreation world. And I pushed back a little bit, but there's a fair amount of truth to it is people get into Parks and Recreation because they've got a skill of connecting with people. And sometimes it's difficult finding this particular skill set, but I'm eager to find that individual and to meet the challenge because I think they'll be a great asset to our team. So we'll begin working on that job description. We've kind of pulled a few examples of different communities and are discussing whether or not this skill is vital to being housed within missions role. So obviously training the key team members on the tools, models, and policies. Then we're going to update and refresh the program lifecycle. So this was an exercise that shockingly didn't take too long. I thought it was going to be like pulling teeth, getting all of our program coordinators and supervisors together in one room to decide, okay, this program, where are we on the life cycle? Is this a brand new program? Are we completely saturated? Meaning our numbers have kind of stagnated. They may be trending up just a little bit. Or are we in that it's time to retire this program because no one's interested in it anymore? And you'll notice once we get the final iteration of the feasibility study, the mission sits relatively comfortably in the standards that pros, in the best practices that pros kind of outlined. And we've got a little bit of work to do in retiring some programs, but a lot of our programs are healthy. So that was reassuring. But making sure that that life cycle analysis is current, up to date. The last time we did it was the end of 22. And so it's time to do that. You have to do it annually according to pros, which we're looking forward to. We talked about the prime versus non-prime capacity use study, making sure that our team understands it, that moving forward, we're all well versed in it, and that we can find a way to kind of help each other make sure that data is accurate. Because our rental coordinator can put in all of the rentals, but it's important to have the program coordinators making sure that all of our fitness classes and program offerings are actually up to date in that as well. And then lastly, making sure that any gaps in reporting, deficiencies that we noticed in the process that we weren't meeting, that we shore those up, and we've got a plan moving forward to address them so that we can speak to all of these elements with a fair amount of certainty and confidence. And then in the words of Walt Disney, way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, this focused on the community center, correct? To what degree did you segregate the staff requirements for other activities in Parks and Recs with regards to events? I'm thinking about the family picnic. I'm
Yeah.
talking about all of the activities that go on where there's a lot of staff involved in weekend programming and things of that nature. And how do you segregate that out from the function of the community center specifically that was part of the feasibility study?
Yes. So that is an impact in all that we do. We have the same team running all of our programs that we do the events. And so in terms of impacts, it was rolled into the community center because all of that planning and all of the impacts happen during a workday within the community center. So those events are rolled into the operations of the PCC, and we really didn't divide them out. But that's certainly an element that we can start fine tuning once we get into the higher levels of analysis.
Yeah,
Well, and it's something that will be costed. I mean, as you look at the cost analysis, so we'll have and work to have clear data in terms of how much time, right? So what is the staff time? What are the supply expenses? All of those things. Like, we will cost the community events like we would any other program that's taking place in the facility. But as you look at that, and if you look around other Parks and Recreation departments, I mean, everybody's doing community events, right? And that, when you look at this hierarchy of programs in terms of value added and that list, and these will be ones where you determine there's a larger community benefit. And so you may subsidize those at 100%. But then that factors into how you price some of your other programs as you move up that scale that don't necessarily have that widespread community benefit. So recognize that they're sort of an anomaly, but they will be costed and evaluated in the overall context of how we need to price our programs accordingly.
related to that, I know that we've talked about the family adoption program. We've also talked about the activities that go around Thanksgiving and the holiday season. You said that December is the highest usage. The conflict between some of these activities and the room usage and availability of rooms continues to be a concern of mine. And I was wondering if that's being addressed and how it's being addressed, because I don't know if we are having those discussions in a substantial way with regards to the space that's allocated for that project.
Yeah, so at least a part of our analysis, that was part of the discussion. And because I'm on that committee, I had firsthand knowledge of some of the impacts to kind of rentals, things along those lines. So I had some insider info and was able to minimize the impact of family adoption on the community center. It still has an impact. But we benefit by having me in that committee so that we can steer some of our programs, meeting spaces, set up and take down in alternative locations so that it's not really too heavily impacting rental use, for example. But you're right, it's absolutely a discussion. It's well worth making sure that we get clarity moving forward. And
Well, even the issue of storage during that period of time, whether it's gifts that are wrapped or
Yeah.
whether it's
It's a
food.
capacity, yeah, it's a capacity, it's all part of that capacity analysis. So, right, we would look at what spaces are taken out of commission for programming or rentals as a result of the food storage that's occurring or all of those things that you just mentioned, the gift wrapping. And so we'll be able to say, okay, here's the potential, here's the percentage of time, prime time versus non-prime time, that these spaces are being allocated for non-revenue generating activities. So it could be family adoption program. It could be any city meetings that we have. We have a policy right now that provides space annually to our homes associations at the community center. So we have to look at all of those things that are taking space in that building that are not being charged a fee and determine where our priorities fall, or can we reallocate space in some fashion? So it will be part and parcel of that whole, next stage of really in-depth analysis that we work on.
How satisfied are you with the product and the report compared to the cost that we allocated for this?
What a great question. So there's no doubt I'm a better director after this process. I think it's fair to say that I've spent a significant amount of time in the report and not only understanding, but clarifying it. And so I think our staff has done a better job clarifying the content. I'm not sure what a fair market value is on, that aha or epiphany, but I believe it's money well spent. Would I have liked it to happen quicker and with less of my narrative involved in it? Absolutely. But there's no doubt that this entire process has made us a better department. And we're able to speak to a higher level of detail than if they had just handed it to us. And at that point, we're trying to digest 130 pages.
Would you have hired them again in retrospect?
I think we
Given-
would have fired them if we'd not been satisfied with where we thought we were going to end up.
Okay. thank you.
Honestly,
Yes.
I think there's a whole unique set of circumstances, COVID, and the impacts of COVID being top among them in terms of, and quite honestly, I mean, as Councilmember Boltinghouse and Loudon, who sat on the stakeholder group, or data collection to this, I mean, we had to spend an inordinate amount of time helping pros make sense of the data that we gave them in order to get to the tools. But the real deliverables, which I think that Penn has touched on, are those costing models, are the policies that we'll be able to develop. It is the spreadsheets that were built to do capacity analysis. And that is so time consuming on the front end. And I think that was his emphasis on staff training and development. And in speaking with pros, it will take some time, but it's kind of like you get the training wheels are on the bike now. And then at some point we're going to get the training wheels off and we may wobble a little bit, but we're going to take off. And then it just becomes routine. And it's part of the work that everybody does to do that. So I think, again, are there things, did it take longer than we anticipated? Yes, which probably means that pros has a lot more hours in this project than we were billed for based on their, original proposal. I think we have been very diligent in pursuing to make sure that the deliverables, they were structured in the right way and that we understood them so that when pros is no longer part of this team, we feel confident in how to use them. And I would say, I think there's an exciting opportunity on the horizon to be able to really start to dig in and implement and train and think about the facility in a little bit different way than maybe we have historically.
I'm sorry. So given the fact that we've got this information, you're going to begin the implementation part. What's the reevaluation of this at what point in time? And would you bring in a consultant again for that purpose?
I think they indicated initially, if I remember in the proposal, and I'd have to go back and look. I mean, the intent is to, to update your business plans and your mini business plans on an annual basis. But I think probably at the 8 to 10 year horizon, if I remember correctly, there's, maybe the potential for that. But I think all of that is really tied to some of the work that you're doing here is you're also looking at trends, and it's talking about how to analyze the trends and how to analyze what portion of the market share that you might have in delivering any specific activity. I think the emphasis on marketing and truly marketing, but we have to have the programs that we think we can capture the market on, and then we have to go to the professionals who can actually reach those target audiences. So I think it's going to require ongoing work, and this will do us no good. And that's a lion's share of Penn and I's conversations of we have to be really clear in knowing and understanding the tools that are being handed to us, because it will be a poor investment if we simply take this report and put it on the shelf. We have to turn it into action. And we have already in many ways. And I think part of and you will see, we've got some final corrections. And so I think in the next week or so, we'll get that final report to you. You saw a lot of the really component pieces at your work session in March. But you'll have that, we'll all have that. But again, as we read it, we wanted to make sure that in 5 years, if we're not here and whoever picks up that report can have some context, and understand maybe some of the things that were really unique about the time frame in which we completed this feasibility study. So yes, we've spent a lot of time in wordsmithing alongside the consultants, just to make sure that we have a product that we feel we can use.
Thanks, Ben, for being here. Really appreciate your time. As Laura mentioned, I've been on the stakeholder committee on this, so from start to finish, have been pretty invested in, seeing what we come up with here. I do have a few questions for you that I'd like to kind of talk through a little more specifically on. And yeah, the first one just is data. What changes are we making to ensure that we're going to capture data better and be able to more accurately and quickly get a lot of these boilerplate metrics that have been really hard for us historically to pull?
Yeah, so early on, we had leaned on our registration software platform to create the reports that would help, fill in some of these deficiencies in data. Now we've got Excel spreadsheets that are already formatted for us to continually fill out monthly. And so that's one of the best takeaways from this business plan is that those models have been created in Excel and are now accessible for us to pull out info, easily import.
Okay. Because I know when we were talking, you were saying it's really hard to pull reports current state. So you're saying this new Excel template will solve for the reporting deficiency that we currently have.
Yeah, what it does is it creates the format so that our reports can easily be
Okay.
copy and pasted within it.
Okay.
And so before you and I had discussed, I was looking for that report
Yeah.
within our registration
Gotcha.
platform, and it just wasn't
So-
there.
Gotcha. That makes total sense. Okay, thanks. And then I just wanted to ask you about your direct reports and kind of your leadership team within the community center. Can you just talk on what their buy-in is on kind of some of this change management? And do you get the sense that, people, do people grasp that these are changes, or do they think it's a lot of tinkering around the edges type of a thing? Or how are you kind of talking about this with your leadership team?
Yeah, so there's no doubt our vision team, which is our leadership team, understands the impacts of some of these pieces. And so they've been they've been struggling waiting this long because, you know, a month or a year and a half ago, I said, you know, this feasibility study is coming in 6 months. We got to get ready to begin implementing some of these pieces. And so I believe most of them are chomping at the bit to start implementing some of these elements. And they're looking to have those discussions where it's more of an enlightened creation time than it is, I just don't know what to do, and we throw our hands up in the air. And so they're looking for that and have been waiting for this opportunity, which is great. There's no doubt early on, pros had mentioned there's an entitlement. And like I had mentioned earlier, people default to fairness. Hey, this is my space. Who decides whether it's devoted to rentals versus devoted to members versus, you know, a program like a fitness class or something. And so that's where we can really lean into the data and these life cycle analyses and start making and informed decisions where we say, this is an underutilized space. We don't need it to be set aside for rentals anymore. Let's full focus on fitness classes and programming. And so I believe some of those discussions will happen easier because of this.
Okay. Cool. And then do we have a plan for being able to delineate between insurance memberships and kind of regular paying memberships? Okay.
Yeah, that measurement is pretty clearly delineated at this point. The next step for us is finding that balance of how much access they get to the facility is value added versus us just giving away the farm. And so that'll be part of this costing, and I believe there'll be a fair amount of surveys that go out, and within the business plan, they had talked about refreshing the community center, energizing it, so people don't feel like if there is any change that things are being taken away from them. It's got to be a message of this is value added. You've had it. We're making it better in these ways, X, Y, and Z. And so that's our plan.
Thanks. And then my last question is just, I would like to request one addition to kind of these materials you provided tonight. And it would be helpful for me to see kind of what your timeline is on when you're implementing these things. You know, what are the 6-month things that we expect to have happen? What are the things that we expect in a year? What's the 3-year stuff? You know, just to kind of, you've grouped it by kind of subject area, which is really nice. If you could take, you know, I don't know, a little bit of time and just kind of sketch out how that would look over a potential horizon, a timeline, you know, not too much time because I know you're doing a lot already, but I just think that'd be really helpful to kind of see when are we talking about some of this stuff and when's more of a long term.
Yeah, we've done some legwork on breaking that into short, medium, and long-term vision. So we can definitely plan on sharing that.
Thanks. However you see fit in that structure is fine with me.
Thanks.
Thanks. That's all I got.
Anyone else? No? All right. Well, thank you, Penn.
Thank you.
Ms. Smith, are there any department updates for the Community Development Committee?
The only thing I would update on is, as you know, we were slated, our contractor that has been doing curbside limb collection following the July 14th storm was anticipating to be mostly through the city by today, Friday at the latest. And then we had the storm that blew through on Sunday and created some additional issues. So we've actually done some sweeps of the community to look at and identify properties where maybe none of the debris has been touched. So they've backed off a little bit of that collection to give people who had damage that occurred with Sunday's storm time to get that ready for curbside pickup. In order for us to be most cost effective and to get the load sizes that we need, it made more sense to just kind of stop where we are and do that. So we've been reaching out. We've got a list of properties where either it was missed on the first collection. It's just interesting. Things have disappeared in a variety of ways. So many people cut it up and disposed of it with their regular trash collection. Our public works crews, if you saw the grapple truck and the equipment on your street, you realize the size and scale of it. And so some of the smaller piles were just more efficiently handled by our staff. We've had some issues in staffing in parks that have delayed some of that. So there are still limbs and branches down in some of our parks. We will get to those where that's a staffing issue right now. But I think it's gone smoothly. I think people have been pleased with that service. But it will continue. We think we can get all of that wrapped up by the end of next week at the latest. And Brian, you don't have anything else from, oh, you do? Okay. There you go.
Our Planning Sustainable Places Grant, number one, we have two of them. And number one is the Rock Creek Corridor. We have formed a stakeholders group. And that stakeholders group will be meeting for the first time next Thursday evening at 6:30 at the community center. And the stakeholders group is composed of a couple of members from the Planning Commission, the City Council, Parks and Recreation Tree Board, as well as some residents who live in the area, some business and property owners in the area. So we're going to bring that group together, kind of introduce them to the study, kind of go over some goals. There'll be probably a couple other subsequent meetings with that group. We're planning to have a kind of a walk the trail event on a Saturday, probably sometime in September, October. We haven't nailed down that date yet, but it's an opportunity for everyone. Stakeholders group, anybody else is interested to be able to kind of walk that trail on a Saturday morning for a couple hours and just reflect on what they see and ideas for improvements or changes or anything like that. So that process is starting. You'll hear more about that in the future. The second Planning Sustainable Places Grant, which is the Bike Ped Trails Connection Study. We interviewed two consulting firms last week and we selected one, and Mark will be negotiating with that firm to finalize the contract. And they'll be getting started with them probably October, November, something like that. And they'll kind of carry a little bit through the winter. It'll be kind of a little bit of the same process. But the group that we selected, I won't reveal their name yet, but they've done quite a few studies like this throughout the Midwest. So they have several staff members that seem very knowledgeable about these types of studies, and they actually came to Mission and rode around on their bikes just to kind of get a feel for what it was like, so they could talk intelligently during the interview process about our community. So we were very impressed with that. So that's it for us.
Okay, it is now 7:43 PM, and with no further discussion, that concludes the meeting of the Community Development Committee. Again, this video will be made public on our website at missionks.org. Thank you.
All right, we're just gonna roll right into it. So we have lots to discuss. It is now 7:44 PM and I'd like to call the meeting of the Finance and Administration Committee to order. While this meeting is being held in person, we are also offering the option for public to participate through Zoom if preferred. Instructions on how to attend virtually are included in the City Council calendar item listed on the front page of missionks.org. The public is also invited to participate in the meeting. If you are participating through Zoom, please either add your comment in the chat feature and it will be read out loud, or note that you would like to speak and we will call on you shortly to make your comment verbally. Please remember your comments or questions are visible to everyone in the meeting. If you're a part of our in-person group tonight, please raise your hand but stay seated and we will call on you to go to the lectern to make your comment. When you make your comment, please state your name and city of residence for the record. Also be conscientious of others trying to speak and speak slowly and clearly. This meeting will be recorded and posted on the city's website at missionks.org. Please contact the administration offices at 913-676-8350 with any questions or concerns. Ms. Folks, please call the roll.
House
He's here, but
he's here.
for the restroom.
Loudon.
Here.
Ryard,
Here.
Inman,
Here.
Chociej,
Here.
Davis.
Here.
Our first item of business is public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to comment now? Go ahead.
Kim Donaway, Mission resident. For clarity for myself,
Yeah.
it was on.
Oh.
Maybe I just need to move the microphone a little bit, speak louder. So first I have a question for clarity, my clarity. So like when you asked for public comments for the last meeting for things that are not on the agenda, I'm looking at this and I don't see agenda anywhere on here. So are you actually talking about action items? So if you're using verbiage for people like me who really get into the details, you have agenda on there, because I would have spoken depending upon, because the action items does not say agenda for me. So keeping continuity in the language. Next, though, I'm all for increasing the housing stock in the city because we need it. What I don't agree with is giving away the farm. So that way I'm supporting these residents and the rest of the residents who have lived here for years on our backs financially. And the developers walk away for years with profits that are taken from the city on their part of tax abatements, and it's not fair. Do any of the developers go and talk to the school district to lower their and get abatement from them? Do any of them go and talk to the county? Why multifamily is the most lucrative real estate out there. And just the amount of emails I got today, it's like, I know they're moving into this next portion, but I really do not agree with giving away the farm. All developers will ask for that gravy train. They're going to do it no matter what. If they get it, they're really excited. If they don't, they've already planned that they're not. Just be aware of how they play. The residents in the city are suffering. You talk about our mill levies and you're raising them up to 18.5%, which y'all are not discussing, because I own properties in several cities, is that we have some of these special assessments that are pretty high that I'm not paying in other cities. And so we're always curious about what's this for? And it adds on to our property tax bill for any resident of Mission. And so, and the last piece goes to landscaping and trees and climate change, because finally they are talking about it. You have the 5 faiths on this planet now
I
addressing.
think we're right at.
Okay, sorry. Take a look at paying attention to the trees that are being planted. These little ornamental things are not cooling our area. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else in the public who would like to comment? Go ahead. Yep, come on up.
Hello, my name is Joe Donaway. I'm also a Mission resident for a while now. I am very much against the mill levy, just based on the raising the mill levy, just based on the fact of skyrocketing property values. I don't think that the way the property assessors are assessing property values right now is realistic. So as the mill levy goes up based on an increased fake property value, we're going to have issues, because what the property assessors are doing is they're assessing current properties in current stage as is against newly flipped properties. And so it creates an artificially high property value. You can fight them. And sometimes they'll throw you a bone, sometimes they don't. I won. But sometimes they don't. And then you have to take it to a higher level and then finally to the state. Most people don't know how to do that, or don't have the time to do it, or don't even realize that you can fight your property values. So the mill levy, I think, will be a added burden that is just going to be compounding the rising property tax assessment issues. Secondly, I noticed that the Rock Creek project is asking for an extension. If there would be a way that we can demand something in return, a concession for a concession, for projects in the future, that would be absolutely fantastic. Because maybe that would stop developers from constantly asking for more and more things. Because if every time you come to the negotiating table with me, you know that I'm going to ask something from you, you're going to think very hard about, do you really want to come to the table with me again? Because I'm going to try to take a bite out of you. If we could attack their TIF status for any more extensions, that would be fantastic. And it looks like they want to build more. I'm just hoping that we don't give out any more TIFs because they're just giving away our money. We could use that money. They don't need it. We do, it seems like, according to the budget. Thank you.
Alrighty. We have no public presentations this evening, therefore we will now proceed with our regular agenda. Our first action item this evening is the acceptance of the meeting minutes from Robin Folks.
Thank you. Draft minutes of the July 5th Finance and Administration Committee meeting are included for review and acceptance in your packet tonight.
Recommend that we take this to consent of council.
Yep. All right. Our second action item is consideration of a First Amendment for the residents on Rock Creek project from Laura Smith.
I forgot to share my budget presentation with Emily, so we're trying to figure out, we may have to take a break for me to
No worries.
move back to my office. Yes, thank you. So as you mentioned, we do have a First Amendment to the residents on Rock Creek redevelopment agreement. I know that Banks Floodman with Sunflower Development Group is here in the audience this evening. So I'm going to kind of just walk through the rationale for the request for the extension. I think I'll have an opportunity to address some of Mr. Donaway's questions as well. As you know, we approved the preliminary development plan along with the redevelopment agreement, which is our contractual agreement with any developer related to any TIF or any incentive request. This happened to be a tax increment financing plan. In reference, just as I think you all are familiar, but for Ms. Donaway and others, the TIF statutes do actually require at the time that the TIF district is established, that notice is provided to the school district and the county, and both entities have the opportunity to veto the establishment of the TIF district. Once a TIF district is established, and in this case, that TIF district was established in 2006, the city then has the opportunity to review and evaluate individual project plans, which may be proposed or brought forward in that TIF district. And so there is, under the TIF statutes, it's different with tax abatement, and we can touch on that later as well. But all of the taxing entities are giving up their tax revenues as a part of this, but the county and the school district have the opportunity to veto. So we approved those back in 2020. You'll recall this was the site of the former Mission Bowl. There was a fire in, I believe, 2015. That's when you started, Brian. That's how we remember. I was talking to Brian about coming to work for the city of Mission, standing across the street, watching the fire. We know there's a lot of insurance. There was an insurance kind of settlement issue that prolonged that. The developers came in. There were a number of issues with the Johnson County wastewater facilities and the cell tower location. They have since 2020 had the need to come back to the council to ask for two separate extensions. Both extensions, the first in May of 2021 and the second in February of 22, were granted. We did those extensions. The first one was by resolution. The second one was simply a vote. It came before you and the council took a vote. We took the opportunity with this extension request to go back and actually make an amendment to the redevelopment agreement so that we could capture all of those previous actions in one place. Again, for historical purposes and ease of us trying to find all of those things. So we've been, I think you've seen as the issues were worked out with wastewater line relocations, we also had some issues. They had some issues with redesigning that kind of sent them back to the drawing board with their architects. I think resulted in some better location for the pool and some other things, but that created some delays. But since they have really broken ground and started work, I think you've seen continuous progress on that project. In fact, I drove past today and it's nice to see the roof going on and really see that building take shape. So they came to us recently and advised of a need to request, they felt they needed to request an additional extension in the existing redevelopment agreement. They are to have the project completed by November 1st of 2023. That's their construction completion milestone. We included the letter in your packet that sort of outlined the factors that have contributed to that, and I can certainly highlight those. And I know if you have questions that Mr. Floodman would be happy to answer those as well. But unforeseen site issues, particularly related to the location of lines once they got in the field, occurred. We encounter that frequently on our own projects. So they've had to look at alternative options and redesign and work around and then get new easements negotiated. So that has contributed in part. Weather delays, particularly in April and May, required them to cancel several concrete pours. The supply chain issues, particularly as it relates to transformers for the project and some of the other electrical components, created unanticipated delays. The demand for that equipment throughout the metropolitan area is incredibly high. In fact, I believe Evergy is rationing transformers and other things to various projects. Labor shortages, which we're all familiar with, and just kind of the competitive labor market, resulted in smaller crews for their general contractors and subcontractors, which meant that the pace hadn't moved quite as quickly as they had anticipated. And then additionally, they lost an HVAC subcontractor and had to find a replacement. The GC has worked on Saturdays in an effort to mitigate both the weather delays and the labor shortages. But they do believe that they need the extension in that construction milestone. So they do anticipate starting to lease up the project at the first of the year and plan to move tenants into the project as soon as they can secure a temporary certificate of occupancy, which I think that they would anticipate would be prior to that September 1st date. They, I think, have watched wisely promises made about the delivery of projects and want to be very judicious in making sure that what they ask for, they can deliver the project in that fashion. Be happy to stop there. So what you have before you is an amendment, as I mentioned, that captures and sort of codifies the resolution 1077, which we adopted in May of 2021, the action that was taken in February of 2022. And then also we took action because the developer assigned the rights of the development agreement, which the city had to accept. So we had an assignment and assumption agreement in May of 2022. So this first amendment formalizes or captures all of those and then extends the construction completion date to September 1st of 2024. The TIF clock on this project is already running, if you will. So it is to the developer's advantage to get this done as quickly as possible. So they are in fact the ones who are potentially losing out on the opportunities by that delay in the project. So be happy to answer any questions.
Yep. What questions do we have? Sally?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment because I was pretty adamant at the time of the last extension that I wouldn't be supporting other extensions. So I just wanted to say, I really pushed on getting a thorough letter from the developer, kind of really outlining the reasons and how this was beyond their control. And reading the letter, I'm convinced that this is a reasonable request and that they're diligently pursuing construction on this project, but that there were just some wacky things like who knew you wouldn't be able to get transformers. So I mean, I think that's not really on the developer. And so I take back what I said before. I'll continue to be critical of developer requests for extensions of time, but I think I understand the circumstances and the ask here.
And Mayor, I failed to mention that you also did push and the developer has agreed to get the sidewalk in front of the project opened as quickly as possible so that this amendment commits to getting that sidewalk open or temporary sidewalk available by March.
Okay, recommendation.
I think we should take it to council non-consent.
Yes, I agree. All right. And our final action item tonight is for consideration of a special event permit for street solicitation from Consolidated Fire District Number 2 from Kevin Folks.
Thank you. Consolidated Fire District Number 2 does their Muscular Dystrophy Association boot block every year over Labor Day weekend. And this year they have again requested permission for a special event permit to solicit those donations on September 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. They have a rain out date of September 4th as well if they do incur bad weather during one of those 3 days during the main event. So September 3rd from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m., September 2nd and 3rd from 11 to 3. And if needed, September 4th from 11 to 3 as well. They will have 6 to 8 people soliciting donations. The special event permit application was submitted and was approved by both the police department and the public works department. And the solicitation will happen at the intersection of Johnston Drive and Broadmoor. I'm happy to answer any questions for you.
Any questions? Is there a recommendation?
Recommend we take this to council consent.
Thank you.
And we have one, I'm gonna kill some time. I can read it very slowly. We'll take a little break and I'll wait for Laura to come back before I read. Might put people to sleep here.
Okay, so just for anyone who might be listening, we're waiting for Laura to connect up the slides for the presentation, right?
Gives me time to reorganize all of my papers. That one's yours, yeah. Yeah, oh, definitely, we can take a little intermission if anybody needs a bathroom break. Okay. Do you want me to go ahead and start reading my script? Plenty of time. Okay. We have one discussion item tonight regarding the 2023 revised and 2024 recommended budgets. Ms. Smith, will you please begin your presentation?
Yes, thank you. You all have a copy of the presentation that we'll kind of walk through this evening. I know some extra copies also available on the table at the back of the room. This is a continuation of our 2023 revised and 2024 budget discussions, ultimately moving toward budget adoption on September 6th in order to meet the statutory requirements for the budget adoption process. I think I was in speaking with the mayor, I said, I'm not going to write a 10-page memo for tonight's budget discussion. We're going to work from a presentation. I think, have all sort of identified the issues. I wanted to spend time this evening to really kind of talk through at least the way that I try to think about it, wrap my head around it as we move forward to make these really important decisions which impact our community and all of our residents. So tonight, I would like to just kind of talk generally, again, what does the budget pay for? What are we doing? Councilmember Kring asked a question, what are we doing? What are we doing internally to sort of manage and address budget issues? And I think it was a valid and legitimate question. And I want to spend some time this evening and just talking about how we do that and approach that. I'll talk a little bit. That includes expense management. That also includes talking about our general fund reserves. We'll talk about some property tax considerations. That's, as Councilmember Inman said last meeting, let's just get to what we're talking about, and that is the potential for this mill levy increase. Let's talk this evening about things that are within our control and things that are outside of our control, the remaining steps in the budget process, and then kind of where we go from there. So, I kind of walked away also in talking with Juliana Garcia from the Shawnee Mission Post about trying to think about how to characterize the conversations that we were having. And it's not so much deficits that we're talking about. It's really all of the things that are competing for a very limited and finite set of resources. So if we think about that in the center, what does our budget pay for? And so, we pay for basic operations. So plowing the snow and putting on the community events at the community center and operating the pool and patching and repairing our streets and all of those things that we do, going through an annual audit process, going through an annual budget process. So those are all things that are competing for those resources. We also look at our community priorities. So that is emphasis on, in particular, street maintenance and stormwater maintenance, deferred infrastructure. That may be an emphasis on improvements to our outdoor park system, any number of things that are coming at us from that community priority perspective. Infrastructure maintenance is a huge piece of where we allocate our dollars. And then we often forget that also competing for those same resources are our general fund reserves or our savings account. And so every time we're putting money into an expense, if we're generating increased revenues, we're also committed by our policies, and we'll touch on this later, to put a specified amount of money in our piggy bank and save that. And so we have all of these things that are sort of coming at us each year and ongoing throughout the year as we try to assess, how do we allocate the resources that we have? So next slide, please. Council members Kring's question and others, what are we doing to manage the budget? And so next slide, please. I think I have, in my tenure in local government, which is now in excess of 30 years, I have not yet worked with a single elected official who took the prospect of raising taxes or fees lightly. And there was always a tremendous amount of consideration and deliberation and discussion that goes into that. And I think as stewards of our public resources, we really have to continually ask ourselves that question. So it's a balancing act. And as we do that, we have to think about ways that we can reduce our expenses. We think about, can we delay purchases or projects? Can we privatize or outsource services? Are there services that we need to discontinue because they're not delivering the intended return on investment? And then on the flip side of that, are there grant funds? Is there other people's money that we can pursue in order to support the projects and the priorities that we have? And then we have to look realistically at fees and charges. I think coming off of the heels of the feasibility study discussion, we talk about how we get more sophisticated and actually costing the services that we provide and having an understanding of when, as I think Penn, I liked his term of intentional versus unintentional subsidies. So, the more we can be intentional and communicate that and know decisions, and then potentially the increase, in taxes. And we know that when we look at sales tax increases, we go to the voters, and we've had tremendous success in the last couple of years in renewing dedicated sales taxes that are available to pay for the priorities that have been also identified by the residents. So just kind of continuing to think about it is just a constant really push and pull up and down. What are we evaluating? What are we looking at? Next slide, please. So a lot of those things happen on the expense side. And I think that's, an easy and it should be someplace that we go in every conversation. What are we spending? And do we need to be spending it? I think one of the things that we've talked about when we go through the budget process is that our largest expense in our operating budget is personnel. In this year's budget, personnel costs are about 62% of that general fund operating budget. When we look at one of the benchmarks that we have to look at, is that reasonable? Is a benchmark of generally you want to be spending between 60 and 65% of your expense on personnel. So we're within that target. We have certainly felt increased pressures in the last year to year and a half, both from competition in the public and the private sector in terms of wages. We've had a lot of conversations with you all about the challenges that we face. You all have been incredibly generous as we've brought to you and made the case for increases in hourly rates for part-time employees or increases for our full-time employees to really help strike that balance and make us a competitive employer. If we can't keep employees, we can't deliver the services. So there are some trade-offs, as we talked about in some of our previous budget discussions, just the personnel increases alone are outpacing our annual revenue growth. So we really have to think about applying all of these tools to get us to where we want to be. And I think we touched on also that, we will hold positions vacant if we need to, and we'll eliminate or combine positions. And in fact, in the kind of the draft of the 2024 budget, we have a recommendation to actually decrease or eliminate one full-time position in the 2024 budget. So we're always looking for those opportunities. You heard Penn speak of a position that was, was left vacant. It's been, a year and a half now. Will probably be a full 2 years. We didn't want to, knowing what was coming out of the feasibility study, we didn't want to rush ahead and replace that position with what had been approved or the job description in the budget. We wanted to be really judicious and smart in thinking about how do we maximize and what do we really need in that position. I think the other thing is, and you've heard me compliment our department directors before and the staff, really the staff in all the department, but they are incredibly careful and consistent in their management of the department budgets. And when you think about personnel costs being, 62% of that, there's not a lot of really money that is left in contractuals and commodities and those things that we purchase. But careful and consistent management of the department budgets in 2022 actually resulted in savings of over $500,000 over what the anticipated budget was. Did we have some line items with budget overages? Absolutely, we did. Pool chemicals, the price of pool chemicals, thanks to supply chain issues and other things coming out of the pandemic, blew our budgets on things like pool chemicals. We saw increased fuel costs. We saw increased overtime costs in the police department as a result of some of just the activity and the time that our staff was required to spend outside of just the normal patrol. And so there've been a lot of things that have been outside of the control of our staff to manage. We had a 20% increase in health insurance going into 2022. We'd only budgeted for about 5%. But we were able to absorb the rest of that impact along with the compensation and classification plan changes that were made in 2022. And so I think it sends a very strong message that we've absorbed those things, we're looking for those things, and we're still able at the end of the year to come back and turn in that $500,000 that can help move us forward. So next slide, please. So the difficult part is where's the balance? I mean, I can balance a budget in no time because I can say, we're not going to do this. We're going to hold all of these positions open. We aren't going to buy snow plows. We aren't going to replace frontline police vehicles, and the budget would be done. We'd go home and we would have had one budget meeting and called it good. But what is the long-term impact of that, right? So how does that impact the quality of life for our residents? What is the impact to our service delivery? And I think we evaluate that continually. I will tell you that, we're seeing, for example, in our aging police fleet, we've had significant repairs on at least 2, if not more, of those vehicles this year. And so we keep those maintenance records. We look at where's that tipping point of where are we spending money to keep vehicles in service, where it might be more cost effective to purchase. That's always been part of the discussion that we've had in management of our fleet. Complicated in recent years because of supply chain issues. We can buy a snowplow and a dump truck in 2022, and it's not going to be delivered to us until 2024. And so how do I think we're learning how to manage and negotiate. I know the police department is looking at alternative ways to sort of stagger the replacement of their vehicles to help spread some of those costs out. But I think that those are the questions that it's easy, and I think in some respects irresponsible on the part of me as the city administrator and our staff if we just brought you a budget and said, here, we'll do it. We're just going to take all these things off the table. And we didn't at least have the opportunity to think about what those longer term impacts would be. At the end of the day, it's all a matter of time, time and money. Next slide, please. Did want to talk just a little bit about general fund reserves. We've talked about these before. We know that GFOA recommends no less than 2 months of operating reserves. And I've done the math every which way. We actually have a policy that is 25% of our annual general fund revenues. So it's slightly different than what GFOA recommends, but each year I sort of go through the process of costing that out and which one is greater. Our policy at this point results in a larger fund balance than 2 months of operating reserves. We can use fund balance to balance the budget or help fund anticipated or unique expenses. And every city is different in terms of what they think is the appropriate size for that fund balance. It's based on sort of how your revenues are allocated or the diversity that you might already have. Or do you have some revenue streams that are more volatile or more subject to economic pressures or downturns? But 25% fund balance really has seemed to suit us well. Now, there are some cities who carry much larger fund balances, even in excess of maybe established policies that they might have. I think our goal here has been to save appropriately and to establish and maintain those reserves appropriately, but not more than necessary so that we can use any excess to advance kind of the priorities that have been identified, whether that's through the Direction Finder survey or other conversations. So any increase, but it's interesting when you kind of stop and think about it, any increase that we have in revenues in the general fund. So sales tax performance is better, or community center performance is better. It actually increases the amount of money that we then take off the top to go into our general fund reserves. So for example, if we have $500,000 increase in revenue attributable to any variety of sources, $375,000 of that is available for spending, and $125,000 by virtue of our policy immediately goes into what I call our general fund piggy bank, right? And so it was interesting to me to just kind of go through the exercise and stop and think about that, is that we have, and we're true to kind of that forced savings policy, which is really good, but it all of a sudden, those revenue increases kind of decrease in a hurry, and what you have available to spend on the other priorities that you've identified. So in the draft of the 2024 budget that we've presented, we're at that 25% fund balance. We've maintained that. We understand that as a priority of the council. And so we aren't, we're trying to figure out how do we keep that balance in the policy decision around reserves and still accomplish the other things that we want to. So next slide, please. I wasn't fast enough on my feet the last budget meeting to think about what are, to add this to the list of what are we doing to help the situation. And when I really stopped and put numbers to the amount of money, federal, state, county, that we've been able to leverage and secure between 20 and 2023, we're doing almost $11.1 million worth of revenue generation to help leverage and stretch the dollars that we ask any of our residents or businesses to contribute. And that's pretty historically consistent for us. And so this pie chart on this page will demonstrate that 9.8 million of that, so the largest portion of that, as it should be based on what residents have said their number one priority is going to streets. We secured a $6 million federal grant, and then we consistently make sure that we are positioned to take advantage of CARS funding and CARS grants that are available. Parks has been the other piece of this, as we've looked at land and water conservation grant funds, and then childcare aware grants for the community center, police and public safety, and the automated license plate readers, planning and development. You heard Brian speak already this evening about the planning sustainable places grants. So I think that that's something that we often forget in the mix, that, it really allows us to continue to do as many things as we do. And I think honestly, that number is low. I think we have the potential to bring in an additional $4 to $5 million. We haven't, the $6 million grant is for the next phase of the Johnson Drive from Lamar to Metcalf. We haven't made application yet, because that's a project that's on a future horizon for CARS funding. We know we will make application for that, and as well as SMAC funding for these projects. So I think we've heard the message loud and clear from this council that you want us to be looking at grant opportunities. You want us to be looking at ways to take advantage of other people's money in order to address our priorities. Next slide, please. So then we kind of get back to really what is, I think the other revenue streams that we've seen, we've projected pretty moderate growth in sales, about 1% in sales and use taxes, that you hope that improves. But I think that's pretty consistent with what many of our neighboring communities are anticipating. We've talked about community center revenue. We know that we have a plan to accelerate that and kind of improve the upward trajectory of that. There's a lot of things in here that we've addressed. And so what is one of the last pieces that we have that we need to make a decision about? And that's property taxes. So I won't spend a lot of time because we've already talked about kind of the decrease that we've experienced since 2016 for a variety of reasons. But I really wanted to talk this evening and maybe think about it in some different ways. That's how I've tried to approach it over the last few weeks as I've thought about the impacts of a potential decision to look at an increase in the mill levy. So as we know, our current mill rate is 16.374. Overall, we're anticipating an increase in overall assessed valuation of about 7%, which is actually lower than what it has been for the last couple of years. So we saw that kind of upward trajectory, and now it's, I think, beginning to slow down a little bit. 1 mil in the 2023 budget, well, that will fund the 2024 budget, it's the 2023 tax year, is going to be equivalent to about $213,000 versus the $199,000 that was equivalent to 1 mil in our current year's budget. So next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of think about, and maybe it's not helpful to others, but it was helpful for me to think about, okay, when we think about what is that value, when we say we see these increasing property valuations, if we hold the mill levy constant, we still have that opportunity to take advantage of that increase, right, in assessed valuation. So coming out of 2022 and going into the 2023 year, that amount that we anticipated that we would capture because of the growth in assessed valuation by holding the mill levy constant was about $318,000 in total. Okay, so in a $14 million budget, it's significant, but still small portion. But then I would direct you kind of to this first box. So we estimate, that's what we estimated we would collect as a result of that increase in assessed valuation. So think about then we automatically take 25% of that off the top because we're going to say we're going to increase that. And so we're going to take $79,668 and put that in general fund reserves. Well, then in 2022, or 2023, we've also experienced $150,000 refund for dark store theory settlement and BOTA settlement cases that were outside of our control. So subtract another $150,000 off of that. And then we have storms that come through in July, and the council wants to be poised and ready to offer curbside limb collection, which we estimate is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $65,000. So all of a sudden that $318,000 that we thought we were going to have available is dwindled down to about $24,000 that's available to spend on all of the other priorities that we've identified. Now, property tax is not the only revenue stream. Obviously, it's not even the largest revenue stream. But it was helpful for me to be able to just think about that while these numbers look big, when we really think about the impacts that have played out over time, it underscores even more the need for us to continue to manage our budgets tightly and effectively and to look for savings and opportunities anywhere we can. So if we think about then, these are just some other illustrations, and we don't know what the unknowns in 2024 will be. 2022 was sales and use tax refunds. 2024 has been storms and dark store theory refunds. I don't know. There will be something. There's always something in every year. If we hold that mill levy constant, the amount, because we are seeing a smaller decrease in overall assessed valuation than what we saw between 2022 and 2023, we would only anticipate about $226,000 that would be coming in additional property tax revenues. And then you take $56,000 of that off the top, goes into your piggy bank. And then when you look at the conversation that we've had around the 18.5 mil levy, that increase on an annual basis is only about $454,000. Again, you take $115,000 of that, put it in your bank. And so just wanted to illustrate kind of a way that it was helpful for me at least to kind of think about all of the moving parts and pieces of how far does an increase in our property tax really go? And so I think we have to, and on the next slide, we'll kind of talk about, and we've talked about what are those impacts to the residents in terms of monthly or annual increases. But I think we also really need to be transparent in our own evaluations of how much we're actually benefiting from that or able to capture to continue to deliver the things that our residents would like to see. Next slide, please. This slide really just recaps what you've seen before, and that is we wanted to look at what is the cost for an average homeowner in Mission if we were to look at holding the mill levy constant, or if we were to look at increasing the mill levy to 18.5. Now, this is based on the average home value in Mission is just slightly over $300,000. So there will be some people that pay more and some people that pay less. And Ms. Donaway did make a good point. So in addition to the property tax, we do have a stormwater utility fee that is assessed, and that's an additional, that's $336 a year that is assessed or more, depending on commercial properties, it's more. All single family properties pay that $336 a year. I don't believe we've increased the stormwater utility fee maybe since 2012. I'll have a chart and I can share that. That was structured in order to be able to pay off stormwater debt that had been acquired to do $30+ million worth of stormwater improvements over several years without having to have big fluctuations in mill levy or other things. So one of the things you want to do with your mill levy and really all of your other revenue streams is how do we even out those peaks and valleys so that you even out that impact, and it's much more predictable for your residents, but it's also much more predictable for you and the decision making that you have. So just because of the growth in assessed valuation, if we maintain the mill levy at the 16.374 for the average homeowner, that's about $3 a month increase, $36 a year. At 18.5, it would be about $9 over the current per month, or $108 a year. And I think if you think about that cost and how it applies to the increases that we've seen, either the services that we're providing or the increases that we're seeing in the cost to deliver those services, we've tried to be very, very reasonable in looking at that. And so then I just reshared some of the information from the Direction Finder survey that talked about, we asked residents, what would you like, where would you support increased city investment? Streets, absolutely at the top, parks, public safety, redevelopment, and then the maximum amount that they would be willing to pay or invest to make those improvements. And again, we talked about there, I think you had significant percentage of people that were, $6 or more a month. So we were kind of right in that target range. So next slide, please. So if we think about a potential mill levy increase, then we immediately go to then what do you do to mitigate that impact? And what do you do to mitigate that impact potentially to those in your community who might be more significantly impacted? One of the things we talked about, there's an 3% increase in our solid waste fees in that citywide contract. The budget that has been recommended and presented to you does not increase the residents' contribution to that. So we're holding that utility fee constant. So single family properties pay about $194 a year for their weekly trash, recycling, yard waste, and bulky item collection. We think that the citywide contract still offers the best alternative and most cost-effective method to do that. We can look at changes to our community rebate program. So we have had a property tax and franchise fee rebate program since 2004. And I'll come back and share kind of some of the historical stats on that program. I think it's important for us to continue to communicate. I I think we saw success in the sales tax renewal elections that we had in 2021 and 2022. We were able to say, this is what we told you we were going to do. This is what we've done. This is what will do with these funds if you support a renewal of these sales taxes. And we would expect that we would just continue to deliver on those. So we're communicating how we're spending, where we're spending those dollars. And I think that's an important part of that. Community rebate, I didn't go all the way back to 2004. So I kind of broke it down in 5-year budget increments and then the last couple, but between 2006 and 2010, we had about an average of about 108 residents who took advantage of the program, with an average rebate over that time period of about $241 per household. In 2011 to 2015, that number decreased by more than half to an average of about 49 a year, with an average rebate of $268. In 2016 to 2020, we saw a decrease again, 32 applications on average each year, but you saw an increase of the average rebate to about $480. And then in 2021 and 2023, we've dropped off to an average of about 21 per year, but an average rebate of about $585, almost $600,000 or $600. So part of that is because we capture, it's not just a property tax rebate, it is franchise fees as well. So as the utility fees increase for our residents, we're giving a portion of that back as well. So there's a lot of questions that if we were to look at, we've talked about the opportunity to change program parameters and maybe change the income thresholds to allow more people to be eligible for the rebates. We've talked about how do we promote and communicate the availability of the program. But certainly, it's something that we would recommend continuing and would be happy to look at, modeling a variety of different, options, if that's something the council would consider. And then I don't know, I'm sure there are other things that we could do. You'll see as we talk about supplementals here in just a moment that there are a couple of other priority things that we've included in this base budget. In fact, next slide, please. So when we think about supplemental requests, I think we're certainly not unique to Mission, but every year that list is going to exceed the excess revenues that might be available to fund those. So we look at department needs, council and community priorities, policy goals, resources available, and they can be funded across any number of funds, including the general fund, equipment reserve and replacement, et cetera. Even with the mill levy, and if you look at, I would refer you to these two general fund summaries, and I did a poor job of getting the titles on them, but you should have one that at the bottom, the last column, the 2024 budget column has your excess fund balance at negative 371,000. That is where we are with the things that we have committed to, and I'll touch on those in a moment, maintaining the mill levy at 16.374. If we were to increase the mill levy to 18.5, and you go to the bottom of the next one, you see we're still upside down, but we've reduced that to about $31,000. Neither one of these scenarios have $385,500 worth of supplemental requests that I think are important. They are certainly not wish list items, and that includes the frontline police patrol fleet replacement, 2 Ford F-550s for public works with plows and spreaders, a floor scrubber for public works, and then laptop and computer replacement citywide. So the vehicles that we're using to deliver the services and the tools in terms of technology and computers, but those aren't included yet. And so I think it's important to look at that and understand that 18.5 mils it's not a magic bullet, right? It doesn't solve the problem this year. But it keeps us from getting further behind as we move forward. And we know that costs are only going to continue kind of to escalate. So you have a handout on your supplemental requests. It's got some blue and green coloring on it. You've seen this before, but I kind of have gone through and we've incorporated some of these things into the budget in either one of these general fund summaries that are before you. So there's a PR and a marketing contract. We've been under contract with Crux for several years as part of our rebranding, and that continued. We will be rebidding that. We think we will see ultimately a reduction in that, but it's a little bit of a balancing act, because one of the recommendations coming out of the feasibility study was that you should set aside 3 to 5% of your overall operating budget, including personnel costs, to effectively market to achieve the results that you want. So that budget probably needs to go up slightly. The overall budget for marketing and other things in the city needs to come down. So there's a little bit of a balancing act. Operation Greenlight. We know we've applied for that for the coordination of the 8 signals along Johnson Drive and then at Nolan Martway. That's still in the evaluation stages. Would require $39,000 as our match. I think we would recommend that if we are successful in securing that we would take maybe those matching funds out of the EPC developer funds that we have kind of sitting as an earmark in our assigned ending fund balance. Electric vehicle charging stations. Again, we have a grant, and Emily, what's the total amount of the grant on that? Big, it's large. It's for the part of a countywide grant, but our portion or our match would be about $45,000. So we would recommend taking 25 of that. So in the 2023 budget, we allocated about $190,000 for sustainability initiatives. And we had committed a certain portion of that, but we had about $135,000 that was sort of uncommitted because we hadn't identified at that point what the priorities might be. So the recommendation would be to take, if we're successful in securing that grant, $20,000 of that existing 135 that's is already available for sustainability initiatives. And then we had also budgeted for EV charging stations at the community center and our Parks and Recreation CIP. So between those two sources, we would be able to come up with our grant matching funds. Safe Streets for All, that doesn't impact the general fund. That's simply CIP, and we've factored that in. Johnson Drive landscaping maintenance. So we've talked about the replacement of the existing landscaping really along the downtown corridor that was redone when the street project was completed in 2014. We've looked at some preliminary design and talking through that. I think we mentioned this at our last meeting, sourcing for a project of that size of native plants. So we're looking at replacing what's there with native plantings, which is consistent with recommendations from the Climate Action Task Force. We wouldn't be able to start that project this year. We would have to then kind of get through the design, bid, and let the suppliers know that we would be looking at replacing that in the fall of 2024. And then we would need to look at ongoing maintenance and upkeep needs between, again, a portion of those sustainability funds and the regular line item for Johnson Drive maintenance. We have the ability to accomplish that. We've looked at business support, and that economic development was something that has been a high priority of the council. We've looked at being able to accommodate street banners and an advertising campaign targeted to our downtown merchants in the MCVB fund. So no impact on the general fund. All of those investments would be funded through the transient guest tax receipts. We would absorb a small cost of staffing for social media and email outreach in support of the Mission Business District into our general fund part-time. And then there were a number of other things, some holiday decor upgrades, which haven't been factored into the budget yet. And then we looked at this budget included an increase in Mission Possible grant funding by $10,000 and an increase to the rebate program of 13,000. That could be more, but that has been built in. We've increased both of those things. Recommended and not yet funded. You'll see the list of the things that I mentioned before, which are vehicles and technology. The projects and the things that we have not been included that we feel need further evaluation include the construction inspector, which would again be a CIP expense, part-time fitness coordinator, drug task force officer, zoning code update, or additional funds for a zoning code update, and a matching portion of a bike share grant, and then not recommended for 2024, the exhaust fan. So you can see, I mean, there's still work to do. And we will continue to do that. But I think we've tried to stretch the dollars that we've identified as far as we can. So next slide, please. So what other things are kind of left within our control as we look at this and we try to move to some final decisions? So we talked about this last meeting, but the transfers, we have transfers out. And so transfers out include what has been about 41% of our property tax receipts that go to the capital improvement fund and are combined with street sales tax revenues and gas tax revenues to fund our street work. That's about $1.4 million. That has increased consistently over time. When we converted transportation utility fee to mills, we were contributing about $750,000 a year. So that we have increased that commitment, recognizing high priority for the community and increasing costs. We know that every street we're touching now in our street preservation program is a full depth reconstruction, and they are, we targeted about $2 million a year, and we've seen with price escalations the last two cycles that we're having to rethink or be creative in some fashion. So that's certainly always within your discretion. How are you going to allocate the property tax mills that you collect under any mill levy scenario? We make a transfer to the solid waste fund to subsidize that residential street contract. We're able, because of some fund balance that's built up over previous year's subsidies, to be able to reduce that, we believe in 2024 by about $35,000, again, without increasing the rates for the residents. And then you'll see, we have our 25% fund balance reserve at a little over $3.5 million. We have this section in our ending fund balance. We look at that money in our fund balance, the total being anticipated at the end of 2024, $3.7 million. $3.5 million of that goes to our fund balance reserve. We carry in that general fund reserve the balance of our employee 125 plan. And so we have to hold that out, and that is committed to another purpose, along with funds that we collect through our municipal court system for ADA that are earmarked for any specific ADA improvements. We've funded a phase 1 and a phase 2 ADA study out of those, and those funds would be available to then begin to make any improvements. And then assigned maybe those things which are carried over, projects which carry over into multiple years, or things that are sort of earmarked that could be reallocated, but we've at least initially identified them for a specific purpose. And you'll see in 2024, you've got about $230,000 of EPC developer funds. We talked about using a portion of that potentially if we get the Operation Greenlight grant. We have talked over the years about using that money to enhance or focus on downtown improvements of some type. But certainly the development agreement does not specify a purpose. So those funds could be available. And then we have earmarked for the last several years about $200,000 that could be contributed to supplement Parks and Recreation sales tax funds for construction of a dog park in Streamway Park. We've applied for a grant for that. There's some question about whether or not we'll be successful in securing that grant. If we're not, we may want to revisit how we're funding that dog park altogether. So those are kind of the other places that we haven't adjusted at this point. But the bigger, really fundamental question is what's our game plan for staying positioned to make sure that we can continue to build on the success and deliver on the resident priorities. So I'm gonna stop there. The only other slide is kind of our budget calendar. The other handout that I provided is just a sample of our community rebate application. I thought would be helpful for you to just kind of see what that looks like. Again, that can be adjusted, modified. I know there's some conversations going on with the county and other communities who either have offered or are planning to offer that, to look at some consistency across that. So that's a lot of me talking, but happy to answer whatever questions we have.
Laura, are you looking for guidance from us on what X's and O's we need to be?
Yeah, I
cutting,
think
or-
feedback on what else you would like, where we can see. I think as it relates to some of the other supplemental requests that we aren't able to fund, I think we have some work to continue to do to see timing and feasibility of some of those. But I think we would also then recommend and say, if we get to the end of 2023 and our performance financially is better than what we anticipated, or we have some of those savings, we know where we go on that list of what are we going to fund next? What's our next highest priority? So we'll continue to kind of work on that. But yes, interested in other thoughts that you have about X's and O's, dollars and cents.
Do we have any other comments, questions?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
We know when we're expecting to receive the decision on the grant for the updates of Streamway Park.
I don't know, it changes every week, doesn't it? It was supposed to be July 30, it was supposed to be May, and then it was supposed to be July 31st. And now I think we're kind of in some discussions about whether or not, because that ground is actually owned by KDOT, there's some other unique factors KDOT signed off on, and we had to get their sign off on the dog park on the front end. But I think there's some other things that the state may be requesting that are creating some issues there.
I guess if we don't get that grant, especially, I would really like to revisit that discussion. I think there's some areas in there of concern, especially for our maintenance obligations going forward. And I mean, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because let's see what happens with the grant, but that's an area where I'd like to revisit.
Okay.
Yeah, and not to go down that path too far, but I agree with you. It's something that I would definitely like to kind of talk about again if we don't get the grant, because I think that piece kind of makes it. So, I kind of look at all these other things, like police cars and things like that are to me a lot more important. I mean, I know the dog park's been a high priority for residents, but also public safety is a really high priority for me. And some of these other pieces as well. And I want you guys to have working equipment here in City Hall, things like that. So I echo that.
Yeah.
Any other? Yep.
I just really appreciate you breaking this all down and making it so vivid and easy to digest and easy to understand. I know that budget can make your brain go a little crazy, and I'm a numbers person, but I appreciate the time and effort you take to make sure that we and our residents can understand where the money goes and the priorities and the historical aspect of the budget. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And also just echoing Councilmember Davis's comments more on the community center from earlier tonight. I would like us to take a really critical look at some of the legacy programs we're providing. And I really just want to, if we decide we're still going to continue with things like the family adoption committee and that sort of thing, is there a way to do it in a way that makes a little bit more sense in this revenue environment? I just think that we should be kind of looking at stuff like that too. And, even things like the MFAC, are we, if it sounds like the pool chemicals are going out of control on what we're anticipating for costs, do we need to start talking about what services we're providing there, and thinking about kind of all of the above. So I'd like to, if we are going to ask residents to do, some of these, granted, like it's within what they're saying on the survey that they're comfortable doing, I'd like to see us look at some areas too on our side where we might be able to trim some things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I meant to mention and I didn't, so I know the mayor had her hand up, but kind of two areas that I haven't really touched on, and that is, but they've been raised by some of the folks in our audience this evening, is kind of developers and incentives. I think we touched on last meeting when we were looking at the tax abatement policy, that it has been the very first TIF project that we did out of the gate, the developer was granted 100% of the TIF incentives. And that was the Mission Crossing project. But again, we're more than halfway through a 20-year TIF on that. And at some point that project will come fully on the tax rolls. But I think what the council has been very judicious in doing in considering future projects that came after that is not looking at granting 100% of the incentives that may be requested. We know that the developers will come through the door with their hands out and they will tell you they need all of that. And what we've seen, and I think we will continue to see as we explore the opportunities around some of the tax abatement requests that we have, is that councils have not been willing to give 100% of that. You're absolutely focused on what is that return on investment. And what we find is you have to find that right balance of, we have an example of where we've tried to strike that balance and ultimately that project has not come to fruition. And so we haven't been able to realize those benefits. And sometimes it's easy to point fingers and try to, find one thing to blame for where we find ourselves. I think if we look at all of the issues and how they've accumulated, it's not one specific thing that has created the situation that we're in. And so how do we look at that? How do we look at the other things we can ask developers for when they come to us with a handout? What can we ask for in return that has value and community benefit? Downtown parking, cash in the bank, lots of options and alternatives. And I think we've been creative. And I think the message has been sent very strongly by this council that you're not going to get 100%. You're not going to get 100% of what you ask for. And we're going to look at, we go through that process with our financial advisor to say, what is the return on investment? What is the, expectation that a developer anybody would come in and do this without some type, so I think that's something that we have to look at. We've talked about, we expect that over the course of the next couple of years, community center revenues will improve. That helps the bottom line. We've talked about, I think someone asked the question in a recent meeting, we've talked about fees and charges, plan review fees and things like that in particular. Those will be incremental kind of changes around the edges. And that part of what I wanted to try to illustrate was it's going to take all of those things coming forward over the next several years to help us continue to accomplish really, when I go to sleep at night, I close my eyes and see that the costs for streets looming out there. And how much our residents
Don't forget stormwater.
but how much our residents have asked for that and all of those things. And so it's not about, shiny bells and whistles. And I think Councilmember Boltinghouse's point is great. We need to look at legacy programs. We need to be really serious in evaluating what we're doing and how we're doing it. I think we do a pretty good job of that. I think we can always get better.
Yeah, I just had a couple of comments, and I know, Laura, that you flagged this in our last discussion, but just in case anyone wasn't tuned in then, I think really honing in on those resident priorities. And as you just said, the streets and that large deferred infrastructure price tag that we have. If you look at our general fund revenues and expenses, our revenues are greater than our expenses until we make that transfer out for the street program. And so that's a large driver of the current situation, but I think we've heard from residents loud and clear that they want us to continue to make forward progress. And if anything, to go faster than we've been going. And I don't think we would have very happy residents if we backed off that 10-year residential street program or some of the other improvements that are needed on that critical infrastructure side. And then I think too, there is, the flexibility for emergencies and some of those items that drive resident satisfaction. So, for example, if we're looking at a $72 difference for the average homeowner and the mill levy scenarios we've been discussing for the 2024 budget, I know that when I've had limbs picked up at my house, if I just have a rotten limb and it falls, it's more than that $72. But having, the budget and being really conscientious about our spending and planning, for unforeseen events allows us to be responsive, like take advantage of an economy of scale and have the city provide that limb pickup where it's going to be, that one singular event would offset the costs for a lot of folks. If you have one branch fall and the city can do that pickup, you're out more than that $74 unless you've got the body to be able to do it in a pickup truck to tow that limb off, which I know is not the case for me or a lot of other folks. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Thank you, Mayor. I meant to point that out because I think oftentimes it's easy to just focus on, you're just asking to raise our taxes and you need to just be better about managing your budget. And you're absolutely right. I mean, what you want in your personal budget or your organizational budget is for your annual revenues to exceed your expenses. And so you're absolutely right. Until we then start to layer on those other things that we've heard our priorities, we are there. Our revenues exceed our expenses, kind of our base operating expenses. And so it's where we're trying to stretch to meet those priorities that creates that. And so it's a question of, do we slow that down? Do we try to keep that on track as much as we can? What options do we have?
Sure. So I have a couple of things. In speaking of some of the legacy programs, there are probably ways that we can partner with either not-for-profits or faith-based organizations that can kind of do some of that heavy lifting and give up some of the space that we have been using at the community center. So that might be a different way to go about it. Maybe we can still get there at the end of the day, but just use, again, kind of other people's resources who may be more than happy to join in on that and become part of that community value. And then the other thing is, I think it's really all about how we present this to the community, because I do see the disconnect between giving developers tax incentives and then saying, oh, but we need to reach into your pocket and take more. And yes, it is maybe $3 to $10 a month, but that's just our piece. When you look at the budget of everyday Mission residents, their biggest asset is their home. And one of their biggest, expenses is property tax. So we're asking for a tiny piece of a much larger, and so I think, I love the fact that we're offering some help for those who need it. And again, getting that word out there however we can, and not making it seem like they're, crawling on their hands and knees begging for welfare from the city, because that's not
Right.
what it's all about either.
Yeah.
So, I do see why and how. I just think that we need to help our community see why and how, as well, in a way that
I think that's
feels
a very
good.
good point. And I think we've talked about, and we didn't touch on it tonight, but at other times we've talked about, and we're here week in and week out. You all are here multiple times a month talking about this, and and we know that it's hard to sometimes keep all the dots connected, and the way that how we communicate that or how we help present that to our residents. But we also have talked in the past about, economic development and investment in the commercial pieces and the businesses in our community is a priority that we see in the direction finder survey. And one of the tools that we have is to be able to use the statutory, TIF or tax abatement to consider how do we accomplish, whether that's an increase in density that adds to our assessed valuation or provides new residents to shop at businesses. And particularly, we talked, I know, a couple of months ago about, coming out of the pandemic and seeing what's happening in our office buildings. And so where we were bringing employees into the community who could shop and eat, they're working remotely. And so how do we exchange? How do we still bring those people in to support? And, again, it's not a be all end all or the savior, but I think it is an important tool, and we need to think about that as being an investment sometimes as much as it's easy to say that's just a, giveaway or corporate welfare, however it gets referred to. And so I think that's why it's important for us to do what we do. And that is our due diligence to really, you guys are you're a tough crowd when it comes to evaluating developer requests.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I'm looking forward to seeing more of, the tax abatement policy as applied, because I really like that a key part of that is that cost benefit analysis, in addition to the but for question, do the developers actually need this incentive? Do they need what they're asking for or some lower amount? How does it factor into an overall economic benefit to our city? Because it might be, I think it'll be clearer to see that and to think about some of those other pieces that we're not always talking about when we're only focused on the property tax element.
Yeah. And I think those things, and I'm learning as we go through, and I'm getting more of these reports and information and wrapping my head around, if you think about, capturing. So for example, the maximum assessment you kind of gave was 75%. So if you think about a 25%, 25% of the revenues coming to us on a property that has increased in value from, 4 million to 24 million is a lot different than what we've been generating in the past. And so we'll be able, I think, to really illustrate those as you consider and discuss and debate those. And I think it'll be really helpful. I think even clear, I know we've had some questions about, I don't know if I trust tax abatement. TIF feels maybe clearer to me, but I think as we move through the tax abatement discussions, I think it may really help illustrate and alleviate, or at least answer the questions, maybe not alleviate the concern, but answer the questions.
Any other comments, questions?
So next step is we have a community dialogue on August 16th. So we will polish all of this up, bring all of the pieces together. So we have all of the funds in one place. And then we will, the hour before our legislative meeting on the 16th, we'll have that community dialogue. So we'll get information out and invite people to come join us and talk with us. I think by that time, I don't know, I would imagine by that point, the notices that the county will send out with the proposed mill levies. So people will be able to sort of see their overall impact to their property tax bills will have been mailed, and people have those in hand. And so we'll work to just kind of continue to provide some illustrations that maybe help factor these things out. And then, as I mentioned, we will have a special meeting on September 6th, ahead of our September committee meetings, to hold the hearing on the intent to exceed revenue neutral and the adoption of the 2024 budget.
Well, thank you, Laura, for this really helpful presentation. And finally, this evening, we have our department updates. Ms. Smith, are there any department updates for the Finance and Administration Committee?
I think we're good.
All righty. Let's see. It is now 9:10 p.m. and with no further discussion, that concludes the meeting for the Finance and Administration Committee. Again, this video will be made public on our website at missionks.org. Thank you.